Thank you all for being here. It's nice to see all of you. It's nice to see familiar faces. It's nice to see students past and present always, and nice to see new friends as well. I'm extremely honored that I've been asked to deliver this lecture to you, a lecture named for no less than Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King. A daunting assignment, but what Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King and their comrades and their ilk remind us of is, who are we to shirk responsibility? Who would we be to step away from offering what we have to our communities? So thank you, Dean Attridge, and thank you to my beloved, indispensable colleague and friend, Dr. Emily Towns, for inviting you to continue marking the King holiday as it moves forward and continues to make us think. And thank you to everyone else who made this visit possible. When I was growing up, of course, there was no King holiday to celebrate. It's still a happy measure of progress for me that we have the national holiday, even though many fought to keep that from happening, and we still have to make the day up here at Yale. Of course, for a piece of my growing up, never forget that. We have to make it up. Of course, for a piece of my growing up, Dr. King himself was alive, and I thank my parents for taking me in 1963 to the March on Washington in a baby carriage, because there was no question in their mind that they should go, and no question in their mind that the baby should be there as well, though neither of them could know how the day and the words of that day would live on in history, and how the words spoken on that day would live on as sacred words. In remembering the march, my parents always tell me two things. One, that though we remember Dr. King's astonishing speech, its unforgettable language and powers of analysis, its rhetoric, its invitation to the audience and audiences for years to come in the call and response of its rhetorical construction to do better, its tough challenges, its sheer beauty, the march was not just about Dr. King and those words. It was organized in large part by A. Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin. There were women doing the foot soldier work, as throughout the civil rights movement, as throughout all movements. There were extraordinary measures taken by so many people, pre-fax, pre-cell phone, pre-Twitter, to organize all those people peacefully in one place. It was a small miracle. And so progress goes, the work of communities of many, sometimes exemplified by the charismatic one who holds the message, who has the words. In my home growing up, we had a small candy dish on our shelf in the family room, filled not with candy but with buttons, political buttons from various causes and campaigns. There was a campaign button for the first black candidate to become a mayor in Mississippi. There was a Si se puede, yes we can button from Cesar Chavez's United Farm Workers Movement. And there was a button from the March on Washington, a button which my father wore to Barack Obama's inauguration 46 years later, an image of a black hand shaking a white hand and the words, jobs, peace, freedom. In the midst of the soaring rhetoric, we remember all those words on that day. The purpose of the March on Washington was in part to seek equality in jobs, with the understanding that once those barriers were removed, once everyone had a fairer shake to have a job with which to support themselves and their families and move through life with the dignity that self-reliance confers, then so much else could begin to take care of itself. That is a struggle that is yet unfinished. But I want us to think about the words intertwined: job, peace, freedom, a poem unto themselves, distilled and economical, memorizable, repeatable, useful. I'm going to speak today a bit about Dr. King's use of language and the sacred words, and also about the work of three African-American poets, Amiri Baraka, June Jordan, and Lucille Clifton, to explore this title, African-American Poetry as the Sacred Word. The legacy of Dr. King is certainly known through acts, but his words are also one of the ways that we remember him, and you only need to imagine if Dr. King was not gifted with language. How would we remember him? How would his message make its way forward? That's another way of saying that there is no Dr. King as such without that language, without his language. And I think that his meditations, his sermons preached on the streets and not just from the pulpits and not only to the faithful, are meditations that stay with us today. But the question of faith, not only who are the faithful, but where do we place our faith in better community, in beloved community, that question of faith is a large one. We now have a corroded civic political discourse. We had one then, it was just in different places, but one that has visibly eroded in the last few years, even though its previous heights were never Olympian. So the challenge to our community is, how do we think of our words and shape them to carry maximal meaning, to understand the stakes of precision of language? Why do our words matter and what are their actual power? My question for this evening: how does African American poetry let us think about that? I think that Black poets encounter the sacred with the work that we do every single day. For Black life and Black history are nothing if not responsive to the call for a sacred response to the annihilating properties of Black life over the hundreds of years on these shores. Where might we find succor? Where might we find guidance? In our communities, in our activism, in our churches, in our families, in our food, and in our music, our songs, but what about in our poems? And what is a poem? That language which demands that we return to it, that which, even when fulsome, is distilled and essential, that which aspires to the condition of music. That which is thrifty in the African American tradition, where thrift is a necessary value, a hallmark, a mode, make a way out of no way, make do, make something out of nothing. And so then poetry, an art form that comes for free, an art form that is economical, and an art form. Dr. King spoke of love as an ethic. Someone should write a dissertation, someone may have written a dissertation, and just go through all of his writings and think about how he uses the word love and beloved. That would be very interesting. The necessary guiding force in our lives. Yes, we know what love is on one level. I love you, you love me, we love our children, we feel it in our hearts, it feels good. But what about the harder kind of love that also guides us and spurs us to difficult action? What about love that makes us say, I think you are wrong and this is why? I think you are hurting yourself and I want to help you stop? What about the love of country that made a Martin Luther King say to the highest powers in the land, you are wrong and you are denying us justice and we demand it? Or the love of country that would make us speak out against power now? It is love which makes us say we can do better, we expect better, we deserve better, we will struggle until we have better. It is love for our communities that makes us hold each other to high standards and ask and expect the best of each other. It is love for ourselves that makes us honor our temples, the only ones we are fully responsible for. King's legacy is so crucial because we have the words to carry it forward. And so I urge you to go back and read not only the I Have a Dream speech, but so many of his other speeches that when I read them make me think, you know, people used to be much smarter than they are now. In his 1964 Nobel lecture, he addressed this concept of thinking about what it is to understand not just what you're fighting against, but what are we fighting for? What are we fighting for? And he used the word love to think about the importance of love that is what he called, quote, not emotional bosh, but rather love of the demanding variety that gives us a vision. Quote, we will not build a peaceful world by following a negative path. It is not enough to say we will not wage war. It is necessary to love peace and sacrifice for it. We must concentrate not merely on the negative expulsion of war, but on the positive affirmation of peace. And now a few more of King's sacred words, speaking to his supporters at the end of the Montgomery bus boycott. Then, as a young minister, he declared that their common goal, our common goal, was not simply the end of segregation as an institution. Rather, quote, the end is reconciliation, the end is redemption, the end is the creation of the beloved community. Beloved community, sacred words which lay forth the principle of being responsible to one another, one by one, in concentric circles. To whom are we responsible? Which child is also your child? 1957, Dr. King, love is creative and redemptive. Love builds up and unites. Hate tears down and destroys. The aftermath of the fight with fire method, which you suggest is bitterness and chaos. The aftermath of the love method is reconciliation and creation of the beloved community. Physical force can repress, restrain, coerce, destroy, but it cannot create and organize anything permanent. Only love can do that. Yes, love, which means understanding, creative, redemptive goodwill, even for one's enemies, is the solution to the race problem. And then in Raleigh, North Carolina, in the role of the church in facing the nation's chief moral dilemma, 1957, some more of the same. He's working out over several years this idea of beloved community. And then to talk about what he's saying about love, the type of love that I stress here is not eros, a sort of aesthetic or romantic love, not philia, a sort of reciprocal love between personal friends, but it is agape, which is understanding goodwill for all men. It is an overflowing love which seeks nothing in return. It is the love of God working in the lives of men. This is the love that may well be the salvation of our civilization. I find echoes and analogs of King's philosophy in the work of all of the poets I'm going to turn to now, first beginning with June Jordan. In addition to thinking about the challenges of communal love, she's also helped me think about the word itself in the form of poetry, as it appears in poetry, and the actual work that word, love, can do, which King understood so well. What is the job or work of a poem, and what are its limitations? Why would a writer speak in the morning in poems, in the afternoon in their embodied self while teaching or doing other activist work, and in the evening in prose essays? What can each form do that the other cannot? Most specifically, what do we want to protect in poetry if we believe, as I do and as Jordan did, that poetry is sacred speech that marks the sacred in our lives? Poets do the work of making images that compel, distilling language, writing with model precision, and specifically that is what poetry has to offer to other genres. It makes something happen with language that takes the breath away or shifts the mind. For the poem, which after all is not the newspaper, must move beyond the information it contains while simultaneously imparting the information it contains. Jordan's commitment to poetry was constant, and it is in those words that we find her simultaneous devotion to the largest possible picture, her keen analysis of the world situation, and the smallest detail, her tending of language. Jordan outlines many of these ideas in her book Poetry for the People, which chronicles her Poetry for the People movement at UC Berkeley, where she taught for many years. And it offers a kind of try-this-at-home handbook for bringing people together across boundaries through the power of poetry in order, quite simply, to make the world a better place through reading, writing, and performing poetry. How speaking poetry can make you braver. To do the work of learning and knowing so that when you speak to the issues of the world, you know what you're talking about and you know what words you use and why you use them. To travel, either literally by learning another language and reading what people who think and speak in that language, how they see the world. Not to trust it to translation. That's part of what she encourages. To come together under the umbrella of poetry, knowing not only what we fight against, here to echo Dr. King, but also where the love is that can unite us. Jordan, quote, "As I think about anyone or anything, whether history or literature or my father or political organizations or a poem or a film, as I seek to evaluate the potentiality, the life-supportive commitment possibility of anyone or anything, the decisive question is always, where is the love? The energies that flow from hatred, from negative and hateful habits and attitudes do not promise something good, something I could choose to cherish, to honor with my own life. It is always the love, whether we look to the spirit of Fannie Lou Hamer or to the spirit of Agostino Neto. It is always the love that will carry action into positive new places, that will carry your own nights and days beyond demoralization and away from suicide. I first read her poems as a child in a beautiful collection, Who Look at Me, that introduced African American art to young people. I am black, alive, and looking straight at you, she wrote, which arrested me as a child, which always seemed to me to be talking to me and telling me to do something. I didn't know what. Seemed to me to be a credo or a touchstone for moving through this life and its challenges. I am black, alive, and looking straight at you. I can only say it like that. That's what the words demand. Sacred words, words that remind us what it is to be alive, fortunately alive, proudly black, facing the world and its challenges. Words that call us forward, a sentence of poetry on its own, without punctuation, all its lessons condensed and contained and portable. And Jordan always wrote about love, whether it be in a whole book of love poems, Haruko, or in her constant asking, I am saying the ultimate connection cannot be the enemy. The ultimate connection must be the need we find between us. It is not only who you are, in other words, but what can we do for each other that will determine the connection. And here we think back to King's concept of beloved community. It was love in Jordan's unsentimental vision that could blaze a path through a world in which multiple scale violence is the rule. And we, the word we, is the site of Jordan's poetry over and over and over again. Real we's of individuals and communities she has worked with, and imagined we's of the difficult and optimistic future that calls for our clear-eyed love and bravery. Amiri Baraka explored a concept of the sacred word that ran antithetically to organized religion. In the poem, When We'll Worship Jesus, Baraka makes clear that he's not interested in the sacred as something that is Christian or church-bound or text-born. He attacks capitalist America's intersections with Christianity and its use of religion to justify slavery, and attempts to indoctrinate people into believing that they should endure their suffering, using the suffering of Jesus as a model for the existential good of their souls. That's not what Baraka's about. He writes, quote, this Baraka, we ain't gonna worship Jesus because Jesus don't exist, except in song and story, except in ritual and dance, except in slum-stained tears or trillion-dollar opulence stretching back in history. Stop moaning about Jesus. Stop sweating and crying and stomping and dying for Jesus. So then, later on in the poem, what is the sacred word that Baraka offers after he's told us, not this, not here, not this messenger, right? What is a set of beliefs, a set of tools based on the past, based on a sharp reading of history, thinking about how to move black people forward in the present? Let's continue when we'll worship Jesus. We worship the strength in us. We worship ourselves. We worship the light in us. We worship the warmth in us. We worship the world. We worship the love in us. We worship ourselves. We worship nature. We worship ourselves. We worship the light in us, and science and knowledge and transformation of the visible world. And so then onward to his 1967 poem, Ka-Ba, K-A, apostrophe, capital B-A, Ka-Ba. A closed window looks down on a dirty courtyard, and black people call across or scream across or walk across, defying physics in the stream of their will. Our world is full of sound. Our world is more lovely than anyone's, though we suffer and kill each other and sometimes fail to walk the air. We are beautiful people with African imaginations, full of masks and dances and swelling chants, with African eyes and noses and arms, though we sprawl in gray chains in a place full of winters when what we want is sun. We have been captured, and we labor to make our getaway into the ancient image, into a new correspondence with ourselves and our black family. We need magic now. We need the spells to raise up, return, destroy, and create. What will be the sacred word? That poem was published in the book Black Magic in 1967. In this poem, black people confront the essential crimes of slavery and its aftermath, its sorry legacies in the form of black people once captured, now still sprawling in chains in a place full of winters, a place of closed windows and dirty courtyards, echoing the initial theft, the initial closed portals, the initial impassable apertures, the initial filth of the hold. And still across courtyards, across the years, across diaspora, black people are still trying to reach each other, make words, find words to become a progressive community that can transcend its boundaries. Baraka in the poem reminds his readers that, quote, we are beautiful people with African imaginations, the indelible origins and sources not only of power, but of expressive power, masks and dances and swelling chants that somehow carry people through to the present day. When Baraka says, we have been captured, he is transtemporal capture. He is speaking about the literal capture and transportation to these shores, but also the capturing of bodies and minds and the needs for tools to vision a way out. We labor to make our getaway, and that getaway is into something ancient, but we cannot go back in time. We are no longer in Africa, so what do we take of the ancient image? How is it carried? What is iconic and portable and useful to black people trying to find a way forward? How can the ancient image, which I take to mean some form of culture, bring us, quote, into correspondence with us and our black family? The family is no longer African, but rather black, diasporic, and we've moved into the present moment. The answers are not easy. Is it magic we need? Asks Baraka. Spells? How to move empowered to the necessary work, to raise up, return, destroy, and create, which echoes that passage I read from Dr. King so beautifully when he says, physical force can repress, restrain, coerce, destroy. Okay, remember, these are peers. Actually, Martin Luther King and Amiri Baraka. It's easy to forget how very young Dr. King was when he was killed. So these people are age mates. They are peers. I don't know if King is listening to Baraka. I'm sure he knew who he was. I have no proof. I'm just sure. And certainly, of course, Baraka would have known about the work of Dr. King. I'm sure, and you know, think of them, both of them on black college campuses in the same years, in the late 40s, early 50s. I mean, they're interestingly analogous, actually. Both geniuses in very different ways. So to raise up, return, destroy, and create, that cadence, right? Even though Baraka is turning from the church, has turned long ago from the church. Que sera, the poem asks, what will be? What will be, it asks at the end, both the means and the outcome. And then the only line by itself as a freestanding stanza is the final line, the completion of the question. The final line standing all alone is the sacred word. And how interesting that the mysterious title, Kaaba, might refer to Kaaba, K-A-A-B-A, the holiest place in Islam, a large building inside the Al-Haram Mosque in Mecca containing the black stone, thought to be stone from paradise, sent from the angels, by the angels to Ibrahim. Or the Egyptian concept of the Ka and the Ba. The Ka meaning kind of intellectual and spiritual power, very difficult to translate, not quite equal to our concept of the soul, but analogous. And the Ba, referring to all of those non-physical qualities that make up the personality of a human being, and that also have to do with power. Remember, the Ka and the Ba, once joined, are what makes it possible for the deceased to leave their tomb and join the Ba, excuse me, for the Ka to leave the Ba, and then they can become an ancestor. So Baraka joins those two words, the Ka and the Ba, to make one, a joined ancestor, a holy place. And perhaps that word is then the answer that we loop back around to after we finish the poem. What will be the sacred word? And we come back to the title that we haven't understood before, Kaaba, African, invented, refigured. What will be the sacred word? Where will we find it? How will we know it? Lucille Clifton is certainly a poet who offers us sacred words in the form of poetry. The brevity of her poems is born of necessity. I write short poems because I have 6 children, she often said. But there's also an ethics to their brevity. They are koans, they are accessible, they invite you back in again and again, they reveal themselves over time, and their profundity increases upon meditation. They are useful poems. Most of her poems are written in lowercase letters, refusing hierarchy, like other poets out of the black arts and feminist movements, of which Clifton was not explicitly a part. And the lowercase letters also create an evenness of reception, so that value in the poem is not assigned by capitalization, but rather through the meaning and the message itself. How those poems understand gesture, how they practice the pith of mother wit, each poem a perfect thing, each word a meditation stone. Here's my favorite poem of hers. I read it on all occasions, and it's a good thing that you can hear it over and over again and take it in. I bet some of my students might even know what I'm going to read. What am I going to read? Oh, no, I'm going to read that later, but no. This is The Light That Came to Lucille Clifton. And you know, Anna Devere Smith says, when you say a word enough, the word becomes you. And so I think that's also why I like to read it out over and over again, because it then inhabits and you can possess it, you can have it, you can see if you believe it. The light that came to Lucille Clifton came in a shift of knowing, when even her fondest sureties faded away. It was the summer she understood she had not understood, and was not mistress even of her own off eye. Then the man escaped, throwing away his tie, and the children grew legs and started walking, and she could see the peril of an unexamined life. She closed her eyes, afraid to look for her authenticity, but the light insists on itself in the world. A voice from the non-dead past started talking. She closed her ears, and it spelled out in her hand, "You might as well answer the door, my child. The truth is furiously knocking." The phrase, "nothing human is alien to me," is ascribed to Terence and to Cicero, reprised by many. Nothing human is alien to the poet Lucille Clifton. In her poems, we learn that to be human is to suffer. To be human is to survive. To be human, we learn, is to harm others. To be human is to testify. To be human is to exalt power. To be human is to notice small things and name them. About a year before her death, 2 years ago, Lucille came to campus. Some of you were probably there. The occasion was glorious, and the pinnacle for me was when she came to my class and held forth for my students, an intense and devoted group who had spent the semester lovingly and diligently studying African American poetry from the 20th century. One of those students wrote me upon Clifton's death to say that she had kept a copy of the poem "Study the Masters," tacked from that day forward, tacked on her dorm wall, and that she read it every single morning for her meditation. So at that point, she'd been reading the poem every morning for a year. This is "Study the Masters," Lucille Clifton. Like my Aunt Timmy, it was her iron, or one like hers, that smoothed the sheets the master poet slept on. Home or hotel, what matters is he lay himself down on her handiwork and dreamed. She dreamed too, words, some Cherokee, some Maasai, and some huge and particular as hope. If you had heard her chanting as she ironed, you would understand form and line and discipline and order and America. There were many books in my home when I grew up, but few of them were books of poetry. And I remember that there were 4 in particular, 4 books of poetry, so I remember them very well. And one of them, which my parents have never been able to explain to me why that book of poetry, next to Shakespeare's sonnets, was Lucille Clifton's Good Times. And that book opened with the lines, "Here in the inner city," or like we call it, home. Here we are, I read from Washington, D.C. Here's someplace that was home as we called it, beyond the reach of sociological language like inner city. That "we" made me think of the "we's" my parents used when they meant more of us than those who were in the room at that moment. We black people, we city dwellers, we who ardently believed in this or that, we our family, we beyond our family. What did we agree was home? As a child, I thought I understood those poems, but the miracle of Clifton's poems is how they turn and unfold and close and turn again if you stay with them over the years. They are small and imperfect things to be held to the light, and she played quite infinitely with the word light in her poems. Light, Luce, Lucille, Lucifer, accepting the meditations that the word invited. We held Lucille's poems to the unsentimented light, the light that Lucille tells us that she was chosen to receive. My students, too, reminded me, this is an insight that came to me from a student, of the light she showed us even in Lucifer. She writes poems in his voice. Illuminate I could, and so illuminate I did. And she's always speaking in her own voice. I think the richest lessons her poems have taught me are lessons about the proximity of life to death and the porosity between those realms. Lucille Clifton matter-of-factly communicates in poems with a grandchild before he is born, a husband after he has died, her mother after he has died. There is dreaming and waking, there is life, there is death. Cancer is cancer, there's wellness and there's illness. But within those states, there are many ways of knowing, listening, perceiving. Her poems call upon all those modalities and recognize the flow between them. Every shut-eye ain't asleep. Every goodbye ain't gone. That's one of the things Lucille Clifton's poems have taught me, to trust what the body knows through the porous scrim between waking and dreaming, between this life and others. Sacred words indeed. No matter how elaborate the words they use, poets strive to tell the elemental truth. As Clifton often reminded her acolytes, truth and facts are two different things. So time and again, she made luminous poems premised on clear truth-telling, but always with a twist and space for evocation and mystery. Physically small poems with enormous and profound inner worlds. Of great poets whose poems are kin to Clifton's, I think of Emily Dickinson's intense compression, to which Clifton adds explicit historical consciousness, of Pablo Neruda's elemental clarity, from which Clifton subtracts hyperbole, just to name a few. They are committed to truth-telling in the face of silence. History in her work is embodied, alive, and autonomous, always alert to its contradictions, as in Study the Masters. Lucille was very funny, perhaps especially in dark circumstances. You have to uncatatonic yourself. You have to uncatatonic yourself, she said plainly when called to the side of a strung-out young mother who was lying in the middle of her kitchen floor with the children all about her in disarray. To be a poet is to be another kind of funny that looks at the world askew and from unexpected angles and questions orthodoxies. And those words, too, those perspectives are sacred as well. And when she spoke of the volcanic tragedy of outliving 3 of her children, she described herself in the future as, quote, a pissed-off Negro in heaven, and who says, when I get to where I'm going, I want the death of my children explained to me. So that is also her very intimate relationship, right, with these very, very profound and sometimes seemingly unanswerable questions that we look for words to help us understand. Few poets also have written so convincingly of celebration, and sacred words are also words that bear joy, that lead us to joy. Clifton invites the reader to celebrate survival, a poet's survival against the struggles and sorrows of disease, poverty, attempts at erasure of those who are poor, who are women, who are vulnerable, who challenge conquistador narratives. There is luminous joy in these poems as they speak against silence and hatred. Won't you celebrate with me, she asks in the eponymous poem, what I have shaped into a kind of life? I had no model. Born in Babylon, both non-white and woman, what did I see to be except myself? When she died, poets who loved her remembered her to each other in her meditations, other sacred words which did not assume the form of poems. If we don't keep our stories, who will? If we don't tell our stories, who will, she said. Poetry knows I will accept it when it comes. She quoted Rilke, hold to the difficult. She loved to say, I comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. And finally, I don't wish to be destroyed by hate. Clifton believed and showed in her poems that there is but a sheer curtain between the living and the dead. And so in poems like Here Rest, and this is the last of hers that I'm going to read, and in others, she often conversed with the dead, crossing those lines without comment. For in her worldview, the dead and the living are in constant conversation. This is her poem, The Death of Fred Clifton. The Death of Fred Clifton, 11/10/84, age 49. That was her husband. I seemed to be drawn to the center of myself, leaving the edges of me in the hands of my wife. And I saw with the most amazing clarity, so that I had not eyes but sight. And rising and turning through my skin, there was all around not the shapes of things, but, oh, at last, the things themselves. That's the death of Fred Clifton. So Lucille Clifton's poems ever reveal for us the things themselves, the things themselves. Passing, that particularly African-American way of describing death, seems quite Cliftonian. The living pass out of one state into another, but passing is ongoing and not finite. Those we have loved are just over there, just on the other side. What will be the sacred words? Baraka asked us, and I think the answer is Lucille has them. Like the preacher, Baby Suggs, who preached her sermon in Morrison's Beloved, and Morrison is the one novelist who I count as a poet. And she preached, of course, not on the mount, but in the clearing. Okay, she preached in the clearing. And she, just to read a little bit of this, in this here place we flesh that weeps, laughs, flesh that dances on bare feet in grass, love it hard. Yonder they do not love your flesh, they despise it. No more do they love the skin on your back, yonder they flay it. And oh my people, they do not love your hands, those they only use, tie, bind, chop off, and leave empty. Love your hands, love them, raise them up and kiss them. Touch others with them, pat them together, stroke them on your face, 'cause they don't like that either. You've got to love it, you, and no, they ain't in love with your mouth. Yonder, out there, they will see it broken and break it again. What you say out of it, they will not heed. What you put into it to nourish your body, they will snatch away and give leavings instead. No, they don't love your mouth. You got to love it. This is flesh I'm talking about here, flesh that needs to be loved. And then ellipses, the dark, dark liver, love it. Love it, and the beat and beating heart love that too, more than eyes or feet, more than your life-holding womb and your life-giving private parts. Hear me now, love your heart, for this is the prize. More sacred words that I think are in continuum with Clifton. A student of mine, who's now a student of here at the Divinity School, Mr. Rodney Reynolds, wrote an extraordinary and prize-winning senior essay for us in the Department of African American Studies, where he examined the role of poetry in the civil rights movement. In the process of writing this thesis, he did some archival digging, and now I want my students always to obey me when I tell them, go to the archive. And he found a clutch of letters between Dr. King and Langston Hughes here at the Beinecke and in the King Papers that are held at Boston University. So on November 30th, 1959, in a letter to Langston Hughes, Martin Luther King Jr. wrote, quote, "My admiration for your work is not only expressed in my personal conversations, but I can no longer count the number of times and places all over the nation in my addresses and sermons in which I have read your poems. I know of no better way to express in beauty the heartbeat and struggle of our people." And so we've come full circle, I think, and I'll leave us with the meditative words of Langston Hughes and an open invitation to continue to talk and think with me about the sacred word and where we may find those words in the work of our quiet seers, our poets. And this is just a short poem by Langston Hughes, Luck. Sometimes a crumb falls from the tables of joy. Sometimes a bone is flung. To some people, love is given. To others, only heaven. So that is Luck by Langston Hughes. And so I thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to talking with you. Thank you.